Okay, I think we can start. 2 minutes past noon. So welcome everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Paolo Ciuccarelli. I'm the director of the Center for Design, and really happy to host this last conversation of our fall series. The Center for Design is the interdisciplinary hub of the College of Art, Media and Design at Northeastern University. And as some of you may know, we love use the metaphor of the bridge to describe what the Center for Design is about. And I think, for what I know, that probably there is no better metaphor for this conversation. But actually, I'm really happy that that this is really bridging many different disciplines and areas like art, public art, social innovation, urban planning, and design and architecture. So it's really, I'm sure that will be really fruitful as all the other conversations in opening up space for discussion, space for future development of opportunities for research. And the spirit behind that is really to explore new directions for design and other disciplines to work together. Thank you to the moderators and the curators of this session, Angli and Kilian. Please, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Paolo. And thank you to all our guest speakers for making the time to join us today. I know things get really hectic at this point of the year. And thanks everyone else for joining too. And yeah, thanks Paolo for organizing this series. It's really nice to have an opportunity like this to bring together colleagues and collaborators to have a more informal discussion like this. My name is Ang Lee, and I'm an assistant professor at the School of Architecture, and I have the pleasure of organizing this panel today with my colleague Kilian Mukweti, who has been teaching with us at Northeastern for many years now and just joined our faculty this year as an associate teaching professor. So you'll hear more from Kilian in a little bit, as he will be leading the Q&A section of this discussion today. So Kilian and I have decided to call this panel Design for Assembly. And I also want to just give a quick shout out to our colleague, Cara Michelle, who has kindly allowed me to borrow this title from a joint lecture course that we're teaching together this year. And so we like this title because for us, it provides a framework for bringing together a group of curators, community planners, artists, and architects who the two of us have had the pleasure of collaborating with in different contexts in recent years. And to talk a little bit about how, public art might serve as a catalyst in shaping inclusive gathering spaces that respond to place-specific narratives. So together, our speakers have kindly agreed to share a little on their views on the role of temporary and participatory art projects to activate underutilized sites, to engage local planning processes, and to give shape to the collective memories of a neighborhood. And we'll be focusing specifically on two specific Massachusetts contexts that are close to us. So Lynn, Massachusetts, and Boston's Chinatown. And since we just have an hour for our discussion today, I'll try to give a really brief introduction to each of our guests so that we can leave a little bit of time at the end for discussion. And so I apologize to you all in advance for leaving out all the very impressive accolades that are attached to each one of our panelists. And so first off, we're joined by Sheila Novak, who is an interdisciplinary artist and arts administrator based in Boston. Currently, she is the Associate Curator of Public Art for the Rose Kennedy Greenway Conservancy, where she curates, designs, and manages the creation of new public artwork, many of which are located in Boston's Chinatown. Our second speaker is Gina Chang. Gina is the Director of Community Programs and Design at the Asian Community Development Corporation, where she spearheaded a number of recent public art initiatives in collaboration with local artists and residents in the Chinatown community. Our third speaker is Park McDowell, and Park is a project architect at Payette, where he has led the firm's pro bono collaboration with Beyond Walls in recent years, including projects such as underpass lighting and wash and fold, which have been widely recognized with multiple design awards, and which we hope he'll share with us today. And then finally, we have Al Wilson, who is the founder and executive director of Beyond Walls, which is a Lynn, Massachusetts-based nonprofit working to regenerate the city's downtown through public artworks that range from large-scale murals to site-specific lighting projects that shed new light on the city's existing urban fabric. And so thank you guys all so much for making time to join us. And we're really looking forward to the discussion. So I think on that note, I'll pass it over to you, Sheila, to start us off today.
Awesome. Thank you, Ang. It's great to be here. I will share my screen and get into some of the details about my lens on public art. Here we go. Thanks for your patience. Okay, so, oh gosh, I'm so sorry. I do that every time. Here we go. Okay, so I wanted to just start with a little bit about myself because the lens that I bring to my work as associate curator for the Greenway Conservancy and as an interdisciplinary artist is really formative in how I think about how I approach my work and you know, my obligations to my community. So I am a cis, white, hetero woman who was raised in the Midwest, has spent most of my life in the Midwest, and I moved to Massachusetts now 4 years ago. And I have lived for all this time as a settler on the unceded lands of many American Indian communities. I received a bachelor's in studio art and environmental science, and a few years after graduating with my undergraduate degree, I began working in public art administration, managing the creation and fabrication installation of many public art projects, predominantly in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And my work with projects such as the John Bigger Seed Project, Open Field at the Walker Art Center, and the Walker Sculpture Garden, amongst others, has really informed my lens on creating art in the public realm in equitable ways that engage community in a process rather than situating artwork in spaces that don't engage community. As an artist, I had the pleasure of actually working with Gina and at the Asian CDC and the Power Arts Center this summer, collaborating with a woman named Cass to create a functional object for an underutilized park, actually on the Greenway, called Mary Sue Who Park, to create this table called Abundance Among Us. For me, collaborating is a really wonderful way to engage in decolonial and equitable practice. I also am very interested in site-responsive, ecologically based works. In 2020, I collaborated with artists Emily Bouvier and Kristen Nesseth to create this piece for a rural art tour in Wisconsin. As the associate curator for the Greenway Conservancy, I work on projects throughout the park. I've been working for the Greenway since February of 2018. And the Greenway is a 1.5 mile long ribbon through downtown Boston with really distinct green spaces. And the design, aesthetics, and planning of this park are kind of the existing conditions that then we respond to with our public art. And a lot of times are trying to create works that respond to the site. So in the top right, we have Andy Lee's The Herd. And it's a series of banners that are actually currently installed. They will be installed by the end of the year, responding to the conceptual framework of the Year of the Ox for the Chinese Zodiac, and honoring the community of Boston's Chinatown. Below that, you can see Luftwerk, a Chicago artist duo, and their work Transitions, which is a light-based artwork in the Wharf District around here. I wanted to just quickly show a couple pieces and think about the different ways in which public art can be created to kind of help reiterate why I think community-based practice is really essential. So this piece by Yinka Schonneberg, CBE, Wind Sculpture, 2nd generation, the 5th edition, was installed in 2020 on the Greenway. This piece is made by an internationally renowned artist who's dealing with themes of migration, colonization, and African identity. And yet this piece, to create it, was fully conceived of outside of the context of the Greenway. The artist did not come to the site or build relationships with folks in Boston, and the relationships that our public had with this piece were strictly viewing. Yuen Wu's piece for Boston's Chinatown was created, Lantern Stories, also in 2020, thinking about themes of migration, colonization, and immigration, and representing the Asian Pacific Islander and Asian American communities of Boston through storytelling and community engaged practice. The Lantern Project was actually building on existing cultural practice of lanterns as a way to create space and celebrate community over and honor some festivals over the course of the year. And in order to create the designs for the piece, Yuen created many relationships with local community members, held listening sessions, did interviews, asked for feedback, and ultimately created a very stunning installation. So again, we have a piece where the relationship was to view, and another artwork where the stories of the community were held very deeply by these lanterns. So for me, big picture, the two pieces could be perceived as successful. We received a lot of accolade and support for getting to brush shoulders with an internationally renowned artist hosting Yinka Schonneberg's work. His work is incredible. I really value the ideas that he brings to a contemporary arts landscape. And yet at the same time, in terms of how the artwork impacted and shifted community narratives, supported different, very personal relationships, Yuen Wu's piece, in my opinion, was much more successful. So I provide those two ideas, and I would love to dig into that more if we have time, but I believe it's time to hand off the baton.
So Gina, I think we have you next on the list if you're ready to share your slides. Thanks, Sheila.
Awesome. Can everyone hear me? See my screen? It's blank right now, so you're not crazy. So I'm the Director of Community Programs and Design. Thanks, Ang, for the introduction. I work at Asian Community Development Corporation. We build, we invest in people and the places they live. So that includes affordable housing. That includes helping provide tools to build generational wealth, like housing counseling, financial literacy. And then we also built out local leadership of the neighborhood. So we invest in youth programs and resident leadership programs, one of which Sheila worked with us as well, and Ang, Professor Lee. Just to set the table on what the kind of work we do in Chinatown, I just want to give us some context. So grounding us first in COVID, we know that COVID really presented a public health crisis, an economic crisis, and also an uptick in violence against Asians, and especially our elders. And what we also know is this isn't really new, right? Like there's been a long history of racist policy and violence and gentrification. And all of it really signals to people that you're not really, especially to residents in Chinatown, that you don't belong, that you're not welcome here as a working class and immigrant family. COVID just amplified this message. So in Chinatown, though, we've always resisted in the face of this oppression and struggle, saying not only do we belong, but we actually deserve places of joy and of healing. And ACDC has been asking youth and residents to design these places for assembly, like Ing said, for healing, for joy. And so we really had to stretch our imagination. Across Americas, Chinatowns are often seen as disappearing because they're so close to downtown and being gentrified and folks are being displaced. So how in Boston, Chinatown, could we have the audacity to say, we don't want to just survive gentrification, we actually want to grow in spite of it. We actually want to expand. So ACDC back in 2018 developed our anchor strategy, which is our creative placekeeping strategy. We're targeting the edges of Chinatown. I think of it like a seashore. So it's the shores that get eroded. And really it's the shores of, this is one disputed map of Chinatown, but it's the shores of Chinatown, the edges of Chinatown that are getting eroded. So you see downtown creeping down, and you're really pinned by the highway and the tunnel here on the southern and eastern edges. So we're targeting the eastern, the edges of Chinatown to really anchor it down and to extend the border. And we do this by activating, addressing a neighborhood need, having a community process. H&O stand for housing and open space. So all of our public art and arts and culture projects are temporary. So we want to be strategic about really leveraging that momentum for a long-term goal, like building housing and increasing access to really quality open spaces. And the last is really centering those most at risk of displacement, the working class immigrant residents. So let's just zoom in into how this plays out. Let's zoom in on Hudson Street on the eastern edge. So Hudson Street was the front stoop of Chinatown. It's where the cool kids lived, I'm told. It's also where kids played in the street, the aunties gossiped on the stoops. But in the 1950s, the state's highway construction really tore down this whole street and displaced hundreds of families, turning Chinatown's front stoop really into this condemned alleyway that nobody wanted to walk down. You'll see the ramp, the highway ramp actually went right up against the sidewalk, the road. So it cast a little shadow. After almost 10 years of organizing with the community, ACDC and community members won this land back, and we were able to build close to 150 homes, which is a success story in and of itself. But the story of Hudson Street is still unfolding. You'll see today there's ongoing displacement, not just from the highway, but from gentrification. So these are all past and ongoing things happening. Just so you know, like C-Mart closed down during COVID, which was a really large essential grocery store in Chinatown. This whole building was bought out where Hela Moon is. I don't know if you're all familiar with dim sum in Chinatown. And what's being proposed right now is like mixed use life science commercial space. So when all of these things are happening along the edges, we're seeing rapid displacement, especially on the eastern edge. How do we help stabilize and extend our cultural footprint? Well, we asked our residents, what would it look like for you to belong? We brought these homes back, but it's not enough. How do you actually heal the social amnesia that's really affected the public spaces? So they imagined a gathering space where you can actually get to know your neighbors. And we decided to bring back stoop culture, whatever helped the communities connect back in the 1950s. And so we decided to launch this project called Hudson Street Stoop, which is a rotating 18-month installation. And we have 4 main goals. The first is to create a sense of belonging. The second is to build empathy across diverse backgrounds. Hudson Street today is not, it's really stratified. There are, working class immigrants. There are Asian Americans who were born and raised in Chinatown. There are new immigrants who are wealthier, who live downtown or in Chinatown because they're culturally, it's culturally specific, but don't share the same economic barriers. There are young professionals and millennials. And so they're all living together side by side on this block, but they don't know each other. Social circles don't overlap. So how do we build empathy across these different folks? How do we also improve access to open space? Chinatown has the worst air quality in the state of Massachusetts if you measure it by air particle pollutants because of the highway and the tunnels. And they live right by the tunnels, the highway right here. So how do we improve access to green space? And then lastly, the last goal is to foster self-efficacy among residents. To say, hey, I know I'm not a planner, I don't have an architecture degree or design degree, but I know I'm the expert of my neighborhood and I know what I need. I know what my child needs, and to have that power actually manifest. So this year we were actually able to install the first installation of Hudson Street Stoop, which is Storytell and Sway, created by artist Gianna Stewart in collaboration with different residents who live next to this green space. And we were able to program it and activate it with stories about Chinatown's history, with art performances and like Cantonese pop music. We were able to bring together folks who wouldn't normally be in these spaces, and connect with our families. And then further up on Hudson Street, I just want to give a shout out to Aang. If you look at Chinatown Backyard, besides where we were looking at with One Greenway Park, if you move up north with Chinatown Backyard here, do you see my cursor? Yeah. You'll see that we actually took over a vacant lot, an abandoned lot. It was actually referred to as the piss lot because it was actually used as a public restroom. Chinatown and that area near the Greenway is sorely in need of a restroom. And so this is where a lot of folks went, honestly. And so we wanted to rehabilitate this space and actually turn it into a collective community space. So our young people, they had $100, no land, and they said, Chinatown has the worst air quality. We don't have any green space. I want to actually plant a garden and start a community garden in this lot. It gave me like heart palpitations because I was like, how are we going to do that? But really leave it to the young people in our neighborhood to radically imagine. And so we worked with them, we worked with artists, the Powell Art Center, the different residents to actually make this happen. We had rotating art installations here. We started a garden. We did different programming and games, karaoke night, pumpkin carving. And most recently we hosted Aang's Place of Assembly installation, which is out there today. You can view it through mid-December. And we held storytelling sessions that could honor the history of the space and invite the new generation of folks living in Chinatown to learn it together and to celebrate it together, as well as to invite visitors, non-Chinatown residents, into the space as well. All right, I'll end there. Thanks so much for listening.
Thanks, Gina. It's great to see some of our Northeastern students in those images too. Park and Al, we'll pass it on to you guys and let you decide how you want to, what order.
I'm going to kick it off. Thanks so much, Sheila and Gina. It's compelling work and it's good work. I'm Park McDowell. I'm an architect at Payette, where I also lead our in-house fabrication team, as well as many of our pro bono projects. Our primary work at Payette focuses on big, complex laboratory and healthcare buildings. But as an extension of this work, we also recognize the importance of engaging and contributing in meaningful ways with our local communities. And we believe that good design is inherently a collaborative process, and it should not be exclusive to those entities with deep pockets. Now, my work with Al and Beyond Walls started in the fall of 2016, and interestingly, this was happening concurrently with some of Payette's work in Northeastern, specifically the pedestrian crossing, for which I was project architect. And this was also the time when my oldest daughters were becoming people, right? They were asserting independence, exploring, learning, building relationships. And so in that context, I guess it's not surprising that I viewed these two projects, the pedestrian crossing and Beyond Walls initiatives, through eyes that were filled with a sense of discovery and delight. And I was relatively unencumbered by the way things had been done before. And candidly, I think that this approach, this kind of openness during the design process, is an incredibly valuable tool if it can be fostered not just internally, but really through the broader project team, like where each stakeholder has a voice which is relevant and which is recognized. And all these constituents need to feel a sense of ownership, of true authorship really in the work. And I think on both these projects, dozens of individuals can say, that's my project, I did that, and do so with complete sincerity because it's true. And that, in my mind, is really the mark of a successful project. That is what makes its value last long after the architect's work is done. And you can see the result. You can see the result out in Lynn or here on your own campus, where we've turned infrastructure into a sculpture that is open to the public 24/7. And actually, both of these projects were recognized this year with National AIA Honor Awards for excellence in urban design and regional design, which is significant because it means that folks are looking to us. Folks are looking to Northeastern and to the broader Boston region as an example of how to do this kind of work, how to reclaim public space for public use. So to that end, I'm going to pass the mic to Al to introduce Beyond Walls.
Thanks, Mark. Appreciate it. So Beyond Walls actually at inception was just a number of residents and business owners and managers that met in downtown Lynn in 2016. This was conducted by Mass Development, and it was around a complete streets project that the city was considering. And so Mass Development had recently decreed that Lynn was a gateway city, and in addition to that, a transformative district initiative city, so a TDI, with a dedicated fellow from the state focused on a 5-minute walkable track in the heart of downtown. Interface Studios out of Philadelphia was commissioned to help both conduct the community outreach and then thereafter some of the streetscape changes. And so this is where Park and I first started really plugging in and working together. So I attended these meetings. And what came out of them, if we advance the slide, was a shared idea around folks feeling that the city was being held back by a narrative that was, the reality. Many of the challenges that exist in Lynn exist in former gateway cities throughout the Commonwealth. Lynn just happens to have this little ditty, catchy song, Lynn, Lynn, City of Sin, which was holding the city back. And then they ultimately felt like the walkability of the city was impacted. So a desire was there for more public art, as well as lighting under 3 bridges that weren't lit, that were areas of high vehicle and pedestrian strikes. From that, 28 members of those original meetings started forming to figure out how can we put up large-scale pieces of art that reflect the cultural identities of Lynn, an extremely diverse community, and then how do we figure out how to light these 3 bridges. Through those 2 projects, we met some interesting characters, one of which had been collecting large vintage pieces of neon artwork, not neon signs, because there was a sign ordinance in downtown Lynn that would prevent the hanging of these signs. So these were, from inception of us collecting these were now vintage neon pieces of art. And that comes into play shortly. And then we were trying to get lighting donated from GE lighting division. We went through GE Aviation, still the largest employer in Lynn, down from its heyday post-World War II boom of employing 45,000 people to now just 2,800 people, but still the largest employer. And we asked for a 1942 IA jet engine, the first jet engine manufactured by a US-based manufacturer, was made there in Lynn, and we received it. So we advance. So this is an example of a piece by Angoria, Dominican-based artist, sizable Dominican population here in Lynn. This is from 2017. Kind of what we're most known for is our large-scale street art. This is a piece by Brian Byung, sizable Cambodian population here in Lynn. This piece on the left is by Wasfelder. Features, if we go back, Jan Metzlinger, who played a critical role in the shoe industry in Lynn by creating the shoe and patenting the shoe lasting machine. On the right, women made up much of the workforce in these factories. On the right is a piece by AdFuel. We can advance as we've gotten better at putting up large scale street art. We've been able to put it up on challenging buildings. This is a piece by Helen Burr, again, trying to find a way to feature different pieces, different demographics within the piece. We recognized that we didn't have a senior in any of our artwork, and so this piece is placed right outside senior living housing in Lynn. And then we've gotten better and better at putting up extremely large scale epic pieces of art. So this is a piece by the artist Smug One. It actually is called The Resident. It features a young Haitian-born resident of Lynn who actually lives in this building. This utilized 135-foot articulating boom lift in 2019 to put this up. You can advance. And so, by this point, Beyond Walls had formed as a nonprofit with the focus of activating spaces to strengthen communities. And we're focused on really former industrial gateway cities. So this is an example of a piece we just installed up in Nashua, New Hampshire. This is to facilitate what they are trying to do, which is a river walk park. This is the artist Kevin Lido, who utilized brought in the YMCA to help put up some of the art, and features one of the folks that we met at the Y is Iverson, who's now immortalized in this piece. And then most recently, helping the city of Lowell, who had a desire for large scale street art, but a process which was basically prohibitive to any artist putting up pieces of art. We worked with the community there and community partners, found walls that we thought were a fit, then worked with the historical board and the city to sort of help streamline the process. And then utilizing community partners, we did an RFP for art, did a ranking of the applicants, 91 artists applied. The two highest scoring artists by this committee was the artist Angoria and the artist David Zayas. And we installed these pieces up there in Lowell, Massachusetts, with the idea being that now it's going to lead to far more art, and hopefully far more art by local artists. So you need the walls, you need the building owners to step forward and say yes. And so hopefully we've achieved that. Here's some examples of that vintage neon artwork. So this, again, got us around a downtown sign ordinance that would have prevented the hanging of neon. We got the city to decree we were right. They're not neon signs, they're neon pieces of art. And then we hung them where the community had identified as needing areas of lighting. And then I love showing this, the underpass here. So this was the state when Park managed to, I'd reached out to Park, I'd reached out to 12 or 13 other architect firms who all said no to the idea of helping us work on this in kind.
So I was far from your first call. This is news to me, but
I'd heard about you. That was a problem, Park. I knew when I chatted with Park that he was in. I didn't know that Park had an amazing ability to bring up his principles to his firm, and so Park created this mock-up of what it could look like, and then it flashed forward. You can see what we actually ended up producing. So this was Park and Payette coming in kind, helping leverage Lamb Partners, an in-kind lighting firm from Cambridge, Port Lighting Systems and Philips Color Kinetics coming in. And then a huge amount of Philips donated hardware. There's 3 bridges, very different infrastructure underneath. And then ultimately me making a crack at the IBW 103, the local electricians union, who donated 10 weeks of free labor to get this up. This is when we announced we were going to turn on the lights. We had over 550 people turn out just to see the lights turn out. This is the Market Street Bridge on the right-hand side. This was the 5th highest incident of vehicle and pedestrian strikes in the state because the bridge wasn't lit. People were crossing under to get to those pillars and then sort of putting their head out and getting hit so they couldn't be seen. That's the union in the middle shot there. And then we had 3 Lynn Vocational Technical Institute interns actually intern on the project. All 3 became electricians, 2 with the union. And then as we've advanced as a nonprofit, our focus has been on really introducing youth to the art, and we've built a resource around the artwork that we give to the public school systems. It's focused on middle schools and focused heavily on ESL learners. And so this is something that we piloted and have now produced. We want to get back to doing festivals. So when you think of the organization and the maturity, we're focused on art installation and design response. I think Park will talk to that a bit more, but things like community shared need for hand washing stations or whatever that ground up need is, whether it's underpass lighting, people being hit by cars, that has to come from the community. And then our street art, which then dovetails to this education and access piece. And so that's the organization today. This was some of our COVID-19 response, right? So we were certainly told, hey, look, up till now, you part of what you've done successfully is you've brought extremely diverse groups of people, culturally, socioeconomically together to experience something. Now we're in COVID, you got to do the exact opposite, but there's still a reason and a need to activate space. It was just very different. And so if we sort of advance here, our first order of business was—
Maybe I'll jump in here, Al, real quick.
Go for it.
But to reiterate that point, I mean, 2020 in particular brought a formidable host of new challenges. As a placemaking entity, Beyond Walls had to adjust its approach to maintain its mission in the context not just of the pandemic, but also the domestic social turmoil. So how do you build community if you cannot gather? How might we use design to elevate the provision of necessary services and support local businesses and general public health? So those are the kind of questions we were asking. And that video clip was about an assembly session as we brought together volunteers from Payette and Boss Noma and Beyond Walls and the community of Lynn, as well as paid interns from Lynn Tech Vocational High School. It represents the process that we use to implement these kinds of things. But I want to do a quick sidebar to say, why we even approach it this way when we're doing the pro bono stuff, how it relates to the day-to-day design process at Payette. And we use this kind of technique to actually reach out on the work with Beyond Walls. So this connects the dots in a way. We use fabrication, models and mock-ups and prototypes to enhance architectural design and to communicate more effectively. And you can see this model if you look carefully. The campus should look familiar. It's in process right now, but ultimately making clarifies ideas, and clear ideas, they enable decisions, and it's decisions that move projects forward. That's what we're all about here. And it's very pragmatic in that way. People can understand the problem, they have a voice in its resolution. It's an incredibly powerful way to facilitate decision making, and it's really a very egalitarian approach, inviting many voices to contribute. And this extends all the way through the construction process. You can see this on the pedestrian crossing, for example, where we added value by recognizing both the constraints and opportunities best known by the fabricator and the aspirations and client needs as synthesized by the architect. And finally, and this ties back into the Beyond Walls things, using making as a tool for outreach and community engagement and building for the future. So there's an affirming connection between the mind and the hand, which occurs when you're physically making something. And that spark persists even after the work is done. And it's particularly valuable as we introduce the design professions to youth and demographics that are currently underrepresented in the field. So in contrast to our immediate, fast pandemic response work, this is a long-term project. We won't see the results right away, but we need to start the work in earnest now to improve the profession for my children's generation. And it's in this context that we did the pandemic era work with Beyond Walls. On these community-led projects, it is important that as designers, we're not coming to the table with the solution in hand, but instead, I see my role as providing an injection of energy and expertise at just the right time to catalyze the efforts of community stakeholders. Now, one of the opportunities really embedded in the challenges of the pandemic was this reclamation of outdoor public space for public use. So what was a parking space for a single private vehicle might be converted into a public amenity serving dozens and providing ancillary benefits for local businesses and public health. So we took the efficiency and the quality of a computationally derived, product-driven approach, and we melded it with the energy of a grassroots initiative. This conversation really about mixed use or pedestrian-centric streetscapes, it's long been cited in planning studies throughout the Commonwealth, but it's really hard to do. It's hard to muster the political will to actually execute it. So in this light, I'm particularly keen to capitalize on our current momentum to deliver fast, attainable, meaningful change. And pioneering solutions that work in different communities as well, something we can replicate. But the key thing is always the engagement of the end users in the development and the execution of the work. We have some more initiatives currently in progress here, so stay tuned for this fun. But I wanted to wrap up and conclude by we all know that this pandemic has disproportionately impacted groups that were already disadvantaged. It's highlighted the inequities that are codified in the built environment, particularly with respect to wealth and race and gender. So in this light, I've begun to think of public shared spaces as the key battleground for combating this kind of built injustice. And it's not just about public work, it's about every single project where we can ask ourselves, how might we build in amenities that serve a broader community, a community beyond potentially the bounds of the design brief? So as an architect, I think our charge is to provide design that is inspirational without being prescriptive, and to approach the whole process with an openness and a kind of humility that invites many voices to contribute. Thank you for listening.
Great, thank you so much. Ang and Angelica, I don't know whether you want to wrap up with anything before we get to the questions, but I really wanted to take the time and thank all our presenters. I have lots of questions, but I'm supposed to moderate and not be the first one to ask. Ang, anybody, do you want to wrap up before we open up the questions?
Yeah, I just also thank all of our speakers for giving us all of these different perspectives. We really wanted the conversations today to be site specific. So I think it's really, really fascinating for us to hear a little bit about the specific challenges about working in Lynn, Massachusetts and Boston's Chinatown, which are two very different neighborhoods, different scales, different sort of types of existing urban fabric that you're working with, different community challenges. But I think it's really exciting to kind of see the sightedness of all of the work. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you.
Great. With that, I would like to open up the floor to questions. So please feel free to type in questions in the chat and I can read them out. Or you can unmute yourself. I think they can unmute themselves, correct?
They cannot unmute themselves. So if somebody would like to ask something live, just let me know and I can unmute them.
Okay. So you might want to use your hand tool, and then we can unmute you and you can ask, or you can type a question in the window. And while we do that, I have something that I want to kind of ask all the 4 presenters. Again, I'm just amazed at how, all the presentations, to me, I'm an enthusiast in engaged processes in design. I'm still learning, but what I found really to be fascinating across all the presenters is that the work that you work with the Greenway, the ACDC, to the work in Lynn, all kind of transverses a whole variety of stakeholders, but centered around community, right? And I think Al's work and Parks bringing private sector as a kind of key, it's a key player into these public spaces, and ACDs playing that role of being, instead of waiting for private sector, actually going out and developing housing that it's much needed in communities. My question to all the speakers is, how can this, how can the successes in all your work be something that can be learned and applied in other communities, especially in Boston? I do some work in Roxbury. I think communities like Roxbury could use some of the lessons that you have learned in kind of bringing all these stakeholders to make what you do happen. Is there something that you can share that you think could be transferable to other communities as a way of replicating and creating impact in those communities? Anyone can start.
I mean, I have a very brief response, but I think much of it comes down to an exercise in curation. It's not just relationship building. It's not just collecting everything together and then somehow magically producing something. It's curating all of the different kind of prompts which must come from the community and selecting those where our contributions might have the greatest value as perceived by the end users, and focusing on those efforts. That's how you get value, and how you avoid kind of spending time on things which are not as useful, not appreciated, or less successful.
I'll just chime in here. Thanks for your question. I think, yeah, there are actually a community in Roxbury. There's Black Market and Nubian Square that's doing great work, similar to what we're doing at ACDC. And I would say that maybe a lesson that I think is scalable across Boston neighborhoods or any neighborhood seeing a lot of displacement or there's a lot of development pressures is how arts and culture is really soft power. It's sometimes it's like it's a lower barrier of entry for residents to get engaged, and also for folks you might not see eye to eye with to understand. So it generates soft power, and then we can use that to really beget like hard power. So where we might not have site control, or we might not have the finances, we might not have the political power in some cases to develop what you want, like affordable housing or new park. So for example, Hudson Street, One Greenway Park, that green space was really used as an informal dog park. It got taken over by dogs and dog owners. And that's talking to like a class tension as the neighborhood's been changing. And for us to put up signs and say, no dogs allowed, that is confrontational, and that is one way to go about it. Building art and a space for folks to understand each other and create an inclusive space, that actually built the soft power of the residents in that neighborhood too. And there was another kind of takeover that actually was convincing and inclusive, and but still centering, not diluting the main point of the space and the residents' voices. So I think that lesson of using soft power to beget hard power is something that's transferable across communities.
Oh, that's great. I really like that take on art and culture as soft power. I've made a note of that to myself. Others, Al, Sheila, and Park?
Sure. I think for the work that I do as an artist and as a curator, for me, the important question is, really consistently evaluating who has power in a relationship and trying to subvert that. So understanding who's creating the design decisions, who's selecting the site, who is even selecting the artist. There's ways through, participatory action research or community juries, storytelling sessions, and thoughtful engagement to create meaning, but also to ensure that the decision makers are the people who will utilize, engage with, and activate the piece the most. So oftentimes neighbors or folks who work or commute through a community. And a lot of times power is hard to identify, and it's so structurally ingrained in how we work that every step of the process has to be critically evaluated. It can't be assumed that because you did a community engagement at the start, that as a year later, when you install a piece, it will have community relevance, because over a course of a year or multiple years, things shift. So bringing people in at every single stage of the process is really essential. And I had a second thought and it just floated away. So I'll leave it there.
That's okay.
Sorry, Killian, did you say Al?
Yeah, I was wondering whether you have any view on that. So, the work that you've been doing in Lynn brings all sorts of stakeholders together, especially the private sector. I don't know how you've been able to unlock that, and wondering whether there's any lessons that you learn from that other communities could find valuable as they look to, create impacts in their neighborhood as well.
Yeah, so I think Lynn, because of the origins and the community meetings that came out, and that in some cases these the desires had been shared for decades, and they were really based on things that, for whatever reason, if you think back, we're not talking ancient history, we're talking 2016, bridges that aren't lit, that are 10 miles out from Harvard University, from all of the money that's in Boston, and they're not lit. And because of that, people are getting hit by cars, and it's been documented, and it's been shared by a community for 4 decades. There was a real drive to figure out how to get that done. And so from that there were so many people involved in that led to it being fairly easy for us to make sure people were at the table to continue to share challenges. And then we developed relationships so that when we went into COVID and when it was harder to have people come out to meet, those relationships had already been forged. And so that's how we were able to talk to the nurses that work in and live in the community that were helping at Lynn Community Health Center and seeing folks that weren't washing their hands, and be able to say, well, shoot, that's what the parties that are working at the soup kitchen are sharing. And that's what folks at the YMCA are sharing. And, so there was an ability to collect from various stakeholders and various community meetings because we were so ingrained and so deep. It gets a bit more challenging as, Beyond Walls, to stay solvent, recognize that we had to expand. Now that we were a nonprofit, we would either serve out our mission of activating space to strengthen communities in Lynn, which is great, which is fine, right? And then you could sort of ride into the sunset, but we didn't want to do that. We wanted to serve some of these other communities that also have challenges with their built environment, underutilized infrastructure, but we wanted to do it where the community was sharing what the need was. And so we viewed that as a 3-legged stool. And so if we're invited in by a municipality to take a look at a challenge, we quickly get to share with them that we need to see residents at the table, and we need to see the business community at the table. And we'll gladly engage when they've done that. Or if they've already done that, they're able to show us and document that. And then in our additional meetings there afterwards, we see that these parties are truly at the table. And it's sort of it's a go, no go decision along the way there. And so that's what we do. And then, but we're also not shy about what we do when it comes to art, right? So we've seen a magic of bringing in local, regional, national, and international artists at the same time into a community to put up pieces of art. And so, you know, the art space is very challenging. You'll often get, it's easy to get caught up in the fray with how people believe you should be doing something. You know, we always do an RFP. We always have a committee. That committee is always made up of local parties within the city, again, that match up to that three-legged stool that help select the artists to come there. But we're also not shy at saying, look, we're not just local artists. We feel like there's a real magic that happens when you bring in international artists that reflect a cultural identity that's matched by a demographic in the city, because we support art and we support artists, and everyone gets paid from inception. But there's some tips and tricks that the artists that are working in large scale that are professional artists, they can advance the skill set rapidly of those local artists and those artist assistants. And then the local artists and the regional artists can certainly share, hey, here's some challenges that are happening in this city. These are some of the things that we're up against in that. And that's then reflected in the art, right? So they make that art by that international artist more relevant to that. And wherever we can, we have obviously participation every which way along the way. So I don't know if that was probably, I'm on my second cup of coffee here. So that's
that's more than I'd hoped for. I think all of you really, kind of broadened the question more than I thought I was asking. So that's really awesome. Three-legged stool, and, the soft power and understanding who's power. But I have two questions, or three now, that I just want maybe across the guests, anybody can feel like they can answer one. The first one is, in designing participatory reports, what are the greatest challenges for community involvement in public projects? I think that's kind of the overview question. Challenges in involving community in public art projects. The second one is, how can we involve students, especially that semesters are so short, and also a lot of students in these communities might not be from those communities. What are some of the best ways we can involve students? And the last one, addition to community creation, like momentum, creating momentum, long-lasting momentum in placemaking projects. So those kind of three questions, if we can have just a quick fire responses from our guests, would be awesome.
A quick response to the last one there. Long-term success of a project is, first of all, contingent on the folks who are going to use it feeling like it's theirs. And so one way we've done that successfully, particularly with these fabrication-focused pandemic things, is to have local students do the work and build the pieces. Then it's theirs as they walk by it, and it seems a whole different level of kind of engagement and maintenance than you would otherwise see. And then the other kind of element would be a kind of longer term programming. So one of the images I shared was, a pandemic era, very active scene at the underpass lighting. And that was, it was a Pride festival that happened just a couple of months ago. That kind of thing, if there's some plan to continue to activate the spaces based on the kind of initial, catalyzing elements, that's how you get long-term success.
With those parties that are doing those activations being local, right? So here's how this thing might work for you, but you come up with the ideas, you come up with those things. And that was really the Pride, where it's like a group of residents sharing with us that they would like to have this sort of color show, and us being able to do that programming for it.
I think we're on time, but maybe one before the minute runs, just anybody want to jump on any other questions of the three that have been asked?
I'll jump in. For lasting impact, all of the public art we do on the Greenway and the work that I have done personally has all been temporary work, which is interesting. So creating something lasting when it's intentionally short term feels like it's kind of a juxtaposed idea, and yet the attitude we are trying to cultivate is that that art doesn't need to be permanent to have a lasting impact. We can totally develop changing ideas and changing narratives around what it means to be in community together. And we're working with like the arc of history and the arc of change. So as the arc progresses, so can the things that we talk about and the narratives we tell. We see Boston as a city with many, many monuments that are extremely old, that were very relevant to people who installed them at a certain point in time. And their relevance has either been lost or is now potentially even offensive. And it's maintaining kind of cultural values that are not relevant to us anymore. So working in a temporary way not only allows us to kind of leverage conversations and grow our impact, but it also allows us to see what is successful and what people enjoy. And so what we've seen is that artwork that is something you can engage with either through touch or experience, activation, or gathering is really successful. And we want to move our artwork to lend itself to community use because of that. We've also seen, like, for example, with Yuen Wu's project, Lantern Stories, which I shared, after that piece was deinstalled, the community proposed creating a memorial to her artwork, which is wild. Just like memorializing an artwork, we memorialize death of loved ones. We don't memorialize artwork. And so to me, what that meant is that the community felt like they were given a gift and then it was a loss to have it taken away. So how can we continue to provide gifts, but also continue to build the expectation that because something goes away, it doesn't mean that it's a loss. It's actually an opportunity for us to create something new. If we only did permanent art, we would fill our space in 5 years and we would not have a program anymore. So how can we kind of cultivate an attitude and an appetite for new ideas and new work and serve our community in that way? And just to touch on designing a participatory process, I took a year to design Yuen Wu's process. I was developing relationships with community members. I was attending events. I was learning about the context of the neighborhood that I was working in before I even released a request for qualifications by which the community could select an artist. That groundwork is essential for any work you do. For the short-term touch base with students who aren't from Boston, that's really hard. You don't have a year just to develop relationships, to develop a project. But as students, I think you have a great opportunity to connect with people who are already doing work, such as the Asian CDC or Beyond Walls or the Greenway Conservancy. And you can piggyback off of existing relationships by attaching yourself to an organization. You don't have to do it alone.
Well, thank you so much. This has been great. And I'm going to hand it to you. I know that we are 3 minutes late, Paulo. I really apologize, but this was a conversation that probably needs 2 hours rather than 1 hour.
Yeah, it's really not enough time. And I just wanted to give Gina a chance to say anything in case she wanted to add any last thoughts.
I think the way Sheila ended it was great. I think the only thing I'd add with challenge between working with the community is so for example, one of the artists was creating something in the lots and a resident asks, "Oh, what are you making?" And then she said, "I'm making art." And he goes, "Oh." And she goes, "Why? What's the reaction?" He goes, "I want a bathroom. I need a bathroom in that space, not art." And I think it's talking about the art that a lot of the residents want to see is functional, something that will, there's an urgency with the community of, hey, I've been living in these conditions for so long. You're not going to provide anything that's helpful for me right now. This is a long-term campaign through your art. And so really having to have nuanced conversations on what's the value of art in and of itself. There is a value of art in and of itself, besides being a campaign driver for securing housing. And that's a big part of our artwork. But besides that, there's value in and of itself. And then also, how do we make sure that we're really not just extracting voices, not just extracting ideas from the community, but really providing something of value that will improve the livelihood right now. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much to all of you guys for joining us today and for being game for this rapid fire format. An hour is really too short, and this is something we should take note of for the future. And for everyone else who's joining, I just want to remind you all that we'll resume the Center for Design Conversations in January with a new series. And then to our panelists, hopefully we'll have other opportunities to bring you back to Northeastern in the future. Thanks so much for joining us. It's great to see you all.
Thank you,
Wonderful.
everyone.
Thank you all. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank
Take
you
care.
all.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.